I'm really excited to be chatting to Aliayta Foon-Dancoes. She's a violinist and recently started composing last year. Her piece for bandwidth is actually the first ensemble piece that she's ever written. She's a violinist with the Aliayta Quartet, and her love for composing, I believe, started writing for the violin. So it's really interesting to sort of see how someone not in the composition world has approached writing for the online environment. Hello, Aliayta. Um, um, just can you talk to me for a little bit about why you started composing?
It's really all thanks to Paul Wianco, who's an amazing composer and cellist based in New York. I met him when I was at the Banff Arts Center in 2019. He was giving coachings to the Aliayta Quartet, and we were workshopping other composers' work. And one evening over dinner, he asked me if I composed in addition to performing, and I just laughed at him. I thought it was outrageous that he had suggested something like that. And he was very encouraging. And I asked him if I were to compose, kind of jokingly, how would I get started? And he gave me a list of things to do, and it started with playing and improvising and recording my improvisations. And I remember I didn't even know where to start with improvisation as someone who's been classically trained. And he said, well, just start playing a piece that you're playing and go from there. And so I started improvising on, I think, first Armory Schaefer, Haydn, whatever we were playing at the time, and recording myself and listening back, and then taking note of anything that I found interesting. And it just went from there. I didn't fully start digging deeper into composing or more interdisciplinary collaborative work until November or December of 2019 though.
Over this process, what sort of things have you discovered about what you are interested in as an artist, and how has that changed you as a player as well?
I think it's massively influenced me as a player because as a violinist, I am always listening to melodies. And this relates to my piece for bandwidth as well. My ear immediately goes to melodies when I hear an orchestra perform, when I hear a quartet, when I hear any combination of people. I am always listening for the melodic line. And I rarely have thought of harmony enough, which is obviously the most integral part of music. So working compositionally has forced me to think completely differently about music, and has really impacted how I hear music.
Do you think you're quite freed in a way because you haven't had this grounding in harmony? Do you think it sort of makes you approach composing in a different way?
I think it makes me approach composition in a different way, but I don't know if it frees me. It definitely, I'm sure, frees me in some ways, but also is restrictive in others.
You talk about collaborators a lot. I think this is a really interesting topic, because I remember when I started as a composer being really disparaging about the collaborative process, and that it wasn't proper writing. And I think I've more and more found how exciting it can be. So what is it that you find particularly captivating, and why is your artistic practice sort of being based around those types of collaborations?
I think there are a few reasons. One is clearly given the fact that my life is centered around quartet. I'm very much drawn to collaborative endeavors because in collaborations you're often challenged and conflicts arise artistically, and those are conflicts that challenge you and push you forward and introduce you to new approaches and new ideas that you otherwise wouldn't have come into contact with. And then I think the other reason is because I'm very self-conscious and embarrassed often about the compositional work that I do, because somehow it feels taboo to me in the classical world, being a performer and a composer, whereas it's almost taboo to not be a composer performer in an indie or pop realm. It feels totally the opposite in our context. And so I think because I'm so self-conscious and very I'm not confident in what I produce yet, being able to share the responsibility for the end product with others is quite comforting. It's also their fault.
You talk about like conflict in the piece that you've written for Bandwidth. Do you think you embrace that at all? Like, how have you, has like conflict been a part of that piece?
Do you mean in the inception of the music itself, or in the...
I don't really know. I'm just sort of, or the way it unfolds, and maybe there isn't, but...
I mean, I guess you could talk about conflict existing in that piece inherently, given the structure of like the first and the fifth movement, or the way that it's built to exist over Zoom. But at the same time, I think it's meant to feel very easy and positive for the performer, and like quite harmonious in what you're hearing and what you're feeling as you play. So no, I don't think that there is necessarily an inherent conflict there that I was intending.
I think that idea of putting things together and sort of ensemble harmony really came across in the piece. And just the way in which that sort of, yeah, I mean, like in the first and the fifth movements, the way in which that line, there's just a single melody line that then is copied by the others. It's sort of, it's very binding. I mean, as someone who does so much chamber music playing yourself, and I know you've played with Bandwidth, like how you've sort of seen it from both angles now. How do you think it like changes the way that people exist in this musical space together?
Working over
this, you know, when you're separate but hearing each other.
Gosh, I think that there's a shift, but also so many things are similar once you overcome the basic difference in the parameters that you're working with. Yeah, I think that's all. It was interesting being on both sides of that process, because I think the biggest areas of conflict that I find in performing remotely are just the basic the problems that arise from technology, you know, internet, people timing out, losing track of other lines. But I also at the same time would say that when there are distortions in communication, other entities arise out of those problems. And I guess that working over Zoom, working remotely, and seeing what comes out of emerges from the difficulties and the obstacles is also interesting.
Definitely. I want to talk about the fourth movement, because you got all my players to make nonsense words at each other over Zoom, and I think it's fantastic, and I just want to hear why and what's going on and everything.
Gosh, it's so funny because I was so excited to write that movement. Like, it was one of it. I was so excited because the amount of times that I've had to play stuff where I am speaking, humming, yelling, snapping, whatever it is, and it's amazing because sometimes it can just feel like the most unnatural, hilarious, awful thing, and other times it just can be so natural and make so much sense, because I mean, just in the same way that if you're playing a Mozart concerto, an instructor would ask you to sing your line. Well, of course, we also can speak our lines, and we can make percussive sounds on the violin, and we can speak them. Or if we were playing the drum, we'd easily emulate the sound of a drum. And so the idea in this movement is that you are working within the limitations of both your voice and the noise that you are creating with your instrument. And those are kind of setting increasing limitations for the other. So when you run out of breath, you stop playing. Every movement really is built around breath. There's exhalations through that movement, and inhalations that are written into the music. But essentially, the language that I wrote into the music, I told all the players, and there's a program note in the score that you should imitate the sound of your instrument in whatever way feels natural, and if it doesn't feel natural, come up with whatever sound feels easy and natural to speak. And it seemed in the rehearsal, at least, that it was fairly straightforward for everyone to work within those parameters.
I think it's obvious that you're both a performer and a performer who has played lots of contemporary music, because it was very simple to sit down and just put it together. I think some composers don't have that other angle, and sometimes the practicality doesn't come through. Do you always want to put your performers at ease? Do you think that's always important? Have you ever thought about maybe actually putting them not at ease is a positive thing?
Gosh, you know what, I was thinking about this today, Freddie, because I actually am wondering if sometimes it could kind of be a fault. The way that I'm always thinking about the performer's experience, kind of above all else, because I'm a performer first at this point, at least in my life. Maybe it will be different in 10 years. But as a performer first, that is where my mind is when I'm composing, is this natural? How would this feel if I were playing it? If I looked at the music, would I understand? If someone told me how to do this, would it make sense? And would I be excited to do it or resent doing it? And maybe at some point that kind of I'll have a psychological shift. But I think sometimes, one thing that I'm aware of is if I compose for the bassoon, I'll definitely not be thinking performer first. So I think that's a place to start, actually, to get me out of that kind of way of thinking.
I think one of the weird things about bandwidth is our interaction with an audience, and the fact that we don't really have one. And even if we're going to do live streams, there isn't that energy of there being another person in the room, and that interaction is sort of stretched and slightly broken. How do you want people to listen to this piece?
I think that this piece is a quiet, gentle piece in a lot of ways. Even the fourth movement, but I do think that it requires the audience to listen in. It's not something that jumps out at you or calls your name. It is something that takes 2 minutes of your time, each movement. And who did you compare it to? Did you compare it to?
Morton Feldman. It's nothing similar harmonically, but Feldman has this weight and just he plays a chord, and there's no there's momentum, but it just doesn't need to push forward. You're just very comfortable. I feel like there's a very similar thing in a couple of the movements of your piece.
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
Aliayta, thank you so much for chatting. If you've been intrigued, do have a look in the video description, and there'll be a link to Aliayta's piece. Thank you very much, Aliayta. See you soon.
Thank you.